this court, our courts must use to determine the mind of a reasonable person, this court is going to be burdened with cases every day of people who speak on the media.
It will depend on who has data.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's a serious point I'm making because it opens things that once we start saying, you know, the responses people make on social media, they even create non-existent people who have posts. So I can actually create 20 comments and I must tell a judge, see what 20 people say when one person said it. So I'm saying the danger of departing from our principle of determining a reasonable person by reference to the vagaries of social media and the type of person that wants to communicate what they think every second as reasonable is dangerous for setting our legal principles.
So reasonableness is a legal construct, isn't it?
Absolutely, it is. I'm saying this because in this case, in order to justify this, what I call a leap of logic, in attaching a word, complete word, that was not used in order to attack what a person said, looks to me like self-inflicted injury. You're attaching something that was not said to you. And in order to justify it, you go and seek an unreliable platform to test who's reasonable. My lady, the point about that fact I've said to you, the only point I want to make is that I'm inviting your ladyship to dispute the fact that the words apartheid spy are a reasonable interpretation of the statement that Mr. Zuma made, or that he said them at all. Now, let me move to the next fact. Why? Because my learned friend does explain how they get there, right? Of course, she cites examples. She cites the Zondo Commission. If you were speaking about spies at the Zondo Commission, apartheid spies, you must be speaking about Mr. Hanekom as a spy in this tweet. It doesn't make sense. It's not true. It can't be. Let me tell you, because I'm lucky to have been there and I know what Mr. Zuma said, apart from what they've quoted. A series...
You know about the transcript.
I know about the transcript. I'm saying a lot of those things, to say he spoke about apartheid spies, therefore, it's reasonable to infer. Mr. Zuma spoke about many things. To quote this, to quote his testimony that is ongoing, he's supposed to go back to continue with that testimony. To quote his incomplete testimony as an example or as a justification for the interpretation is simply impermissible. For this reason, because he says it's the plan I was talking about, right? He says, if you look at the tweet, Mr. Zuma says this, he says, it's part of the plan I mentioned at the Zondo Commission. Now, what plan did he mention? What plan makes us infer that, well, because he refers to that plan, he means apartheid spy? No, here is the plan. It's a series of issues. One is the plan to oust him at different times, not once, not a once-off. He gives his testimony. I'm doing this because it's dangerous to look at his testimony at the Zondo Commission in a self-serving way like it's done here. You've got to look at it in its complete context and totality. Is that it's a testimony about plan at different times of his life, at different times of his political life and positions he held, to either get rid of him, and one of them, he says there in the commission, he was removed as chief of intelligence. That's a separate plan. Another plan is to eliminate him. He's not calling Mr. Hanekom a killer just because he talked about a plan that he would be killed. No, he wouldn't. Another plan to get rid of him in different ways. Now here is the plan that we must draw if we are reasonable here. Is that one of the plans he talks about in that testimony is the plan to oust him as a head of state. you cannot reasonably deduce from the mention of that plan to jump to a conclusion. Because he talks about that plan, he means I'm an apartheid spy 25 years ago. It can't be. So, what are we left with? Now that I've explained that the justification for this interpretation is largely what he said as Zondo Commission, this court cannot rely on that. At the Zondo Commission, or in this tweet, Mr. Zuma never calls Mr. Hanekom a spy.
That's commonplace.
That is?
That's commonplace.
Indeed. We are told he may. And we are told that because we insinuate, they say Mr. Zuma insinuates that he may. I want to submit to your leadership that that submission, that it's insinuated, is equally unjustified. There is no factual basis for that interpretation at all. So, the statement that Mr. Hanekom was a spy emerges from his papers, is attached by him in his notice of motion. I think it's paragraph 7. He attaches it. His own affidavit is replete with references like that. I submit that there is absolutely no reason, no factual basis for this accusation against Mr. Hanekom, that it emerges from Mr. Zuma. Nor is there any suggestion in these papers of what he said, either that he said so or that he will say so. Of course, there is speculation. One of the reliefs in these proceedings, my lady, is speculative. Our learned friend told us at the end that, well, you have the duty to interdict unlawfulness happening in other legal proceedings, if it will. He says, because he may. What if he says Mr. Hanekom is a spy at the Zondo Commission, let's say on the 20th of October, when he goes back, or the 11th of November? Can this court interdict a witness who has not testified about the thing they anticipate? Can this court competently issue a remedy like that, a relief? You will not testify and call Mr. Skakane a witch in legal proceedings in the future. No, that remedy is incompetent. Is there a basis to reach the point that you suspect that because it's unlawful, you can't allow an unlawful conduct to proceed? That's what my learned friend says. Well, the question I would ask for this court to determine, is this court, as we sit today, now, the right forum to determine the lawfulness or otherwise of that interpretation or that fact? I submit it isn't. You cannot interdict a witness who may present testimony. The Judicial Commission of Inquiry may or may not say Mr. Hanekom was a spy. We sitting in this room do not know the basis of that testimony, if it will happen, whether it's really senseless or it's with evidence. We are simply incapable of anticipating that, but we cannot interdict a witness in future not to say something he has not said, because we impose on this court a duty it does not have to determine disputes that are not before it. It is not before this court whether Mr. Hanekom was or was not a spy. You would need a lot of witnesses to do that, and it is not what is before. I'm therefore submitting that if your ladyship is with me, that both the statement by Mr. Zuma and the events that are used to justify the interpretation about which we are today are wrong. There is no justification for that. My lady, there is a lot of talk in these papers about either Mr. Zuma's role or Mr. Hanekom's role. May I suggest that while these things are in the papers, and it is the temptation that this court and lawyers should not get into, it's unhelpful. Their roles in the liberation movements are not in question in this court. And it would be dangerous for us and my learned friend to start venturing into between Mr. Zuma and Mr. Hanekom, who's the top freedom fighter. It's not what we must determine. What we must determine is, has the applicant here, Mr. Hanekom, reasonably brought a statement that could reasonably be interpreted the way he says? That is the test. Is whether that statement he said, which is not disputed, he said it, is it reasonable to say in these proceedings that a reasonable person would have interpreted it to mean enemy agent? I submit this, and this is what we do in the heads. I don't want to read the parts about the debate in politics, what terms are used. What I'm saying is that the use of the word enemy in this context means a foe and adversary. The word, to the extent that there was an exchange about what is an agent. Well, I'm saying this because we try to analyze what political speak is that an agent in the context of what happened, of common cause facts, that Mr. Hanekom was, I don't like the word plot, but that's what Mr. Malema uses, was discussing with opponents of his party to get rid of an elected leader of his party. Now, we should take away whether we like what he ultimately did and achieved to remove Zuma. That's not what we are about here. We may or may not like Mr. Zuma. What we are about is it reasonable and correct for a member elected on a particular political mandate by representatives of that party who have not resolved to remove their elected leadership? They have not. For that member, discipline, professed loyalty to that party, to collude with those who want to oust its elected leader. Now, my learned friends sort of boastfully talks about eventually the NEC got rid of Mr. Zuma. Of course, he resigned, got rid of Mr. Zuma. That's not the question. I'm not even asking that we should determine whether we jumped up with joy when Mr. Zuma resigned. No, that's not what this court must determine. What this court must determine is, at the time this conversation is happening between a member of this party with those outside this party, was it appropriate conduct in the context of that party? And it's for that reason that I've attached, and if your ladyship looks at the ANC constitution, and I used it only for this purpose, it's such, we've attached it to the supplementary affidavits. We don't have to go there, but may I make the citation? It's section 25.17.4.1. It's a series of things. It's a section in the ANC constitution about acts of misconduct. Therein, your ladyship will see that, because we can't just describe these things in terms of our own political views and preferences outside the context where they are happening. We're not ANC members. We have no ability to interpret the politics of the ANC as lawyers and judges outside that. What guides us, because we don't know what goes in there, what guides us is to look at how do they themselves describe conduct about which this court is being asked to deliberate. And I'm using that because your ladyship will see in that section that this very admitted conduct by the chair of the ANC of its disciplinary hearings, this conduct is described in this constitution as an offense. That's the context. And I'm raising it because if we get outside the prescripts of these parties, we delve into our own value judgments about people we like or dislike, and we're going to go wrong. If we look at that, it's the useful context for us to know, how does the ANC describe that act? And I use the fact that Mr. Hanekom talks about his loyalty to the ANC. I use it not to denigrate him. I use it to the extent that this conduct is contrary to his own constitution of the party to which he is loyal. And I'm not suggesting that there was no greater good or rationale for what eventually happened, what they were plotting politically. It's not my business, and it's not my learned friend's business or the court's business. In the context of what he was doing within that party, was it permitted act? And I submit, clearly, it's misconduct. What does the ANC say when Mr. Hanekom has done this? Because that's another guidance for us. It's not what my learned friend thinks or what I think. No. His own party issues a statement when the revelations about his conduct come. And that, my lady, is, we've attached it. It's, Jay, yes. But let me, 2 words, strong, used by his own party, not Mr. Zuma. Charlatan, wedge driver. I'm not suggesting they're right. I'm just saying this hyperbole here, that the biggest attack on Mr. Hanekom has come from Mr. Zuma, for which he may be killed and people will harm him. I do not dispute that these tweets, who sit on their phones to write tweets, most of them cannot do unreasonable things. I'm saying to link it to Mr. Zuma's description in a political debate is a leap. His party calls him that. Another structure of his party uses the same word, the MKMVA. We've attached their statement. It's JGZ6. They use the same terms. And I don't want to be misunderstood, my lady, as saying anything about these terms they use. I use them only to indicate this. There is something your ladyship must ask about this singling out of what Mr. Zuma says and attach it a meaning to it that he did not say, he did not mean, and I've explained it's not reasonable to reach it. Let's say, my lady, you grant this relief, because I think emotionally we've heard what will happen and how painful this thing is of being called this, and people will do all sorts of things to you. Let's be practical, because we don't come to court to have a symposium about these ideas. Let's be practical about the relief. Let's say your ladyship grants this relief today. What happens? What happens to the worst things people are saying about him? Worse than saying he's an enemy agent. So the relief does not deal with that. And the reason it doesn't is because this relief, the basis, the very foundation of this relief is wrong. It is not what Mr. Zuma said, nor is it what Mr. Malema said. What we must assess is exactly what is the source, the real source of the painful things that people say to each other in political debate when no one had suggested that. I do not think I have to cite examples of how people on social media speak about a lot of things, attacks on judges, attacks on politicians and everyone, when the person who originated the idea, the discussion, said nothing related to what they ultimately say. And I'm suggesting that there is absolutely no reasonable basis for reaching the conclusion, the interpretation that has been reached. And if we are right on that point, if we are right, the court doesn't have to deal with anything else because it was not said. That's the first thing. Secondly, it is not reasonable to attach that interpretation to those words. And the only reference are two things. One is in the history of South Africa and apartheid. Enemy used to mean apartheid spy. Right? I'm not even sure that's the only context of enemy. I'm not sure if you went to NIS or SADF, those were on the side of apartheid, that's the interpretation they'll give you. Because it's nebulous. To say the use of enemy agent was used to describe those who were apartheid spy itself is not an accurate description of things. But we don't even have to go there because it is so far behind us that so much. In fact, my learned friend starts with something I've seen in a judgment, and I don't even think it should be done. It starts with some venture into the new president and what he said, right? He ventures into describing what the president said about the dangers of calling someone a spy. Wedge driving. Yeah, all of the words my client never used. They're dangerous words.
No, she's quoting from Tambo.
Yes.
She's quoting from Tambo.
It's quoting from Tambo, and he's saying that it's a dangerous word to use. I do not dispute that, and I don't think Mr. Zuma would. I don't think he would dispute that. What he would dispute is that his tweet should be attached to that, or that those who said that were saying it inspired by him. No. In fact, my learned friend says, no, it doesn't matter. The others are involved in political mudslinging. They can say anything. But Mr. Zuma can't say he was a known enemy agent. And some of the things people say that she calls acceptable political mudslinging, I feel are an insult and worse offense to Mr. Hanekom than this tweet. And I think it's a leap to say more dangerous things are just mere political mudslinging, and the less dangerous thing, because of the identity of the person who said it, and this court must describe it the way he does and not the others. Your ladyship will see then that one of the things I said we're not taking the point about the reasonable publication, because it's a defense available to the media, and it's not a point I want to take, because I don't think we need to get there at all. It's a defense available. Whether in future we will describe these people who tweet as journalists, we will see. But for now, I wouldn't make a suggestion that it's the equivalent of the media at the moment that invites or has to enjoy the defenses that our media has. Now, I have made references, and I invite your ladyship to do the same in respect of all the tweets that followed. Because you will see, even this idea that those tweets necessarily say Mr. Hanekom was a spy, I think they say a couple of things, and they are attached to Mr. Hanekom's wanting statement. And I'm not saying those things are nice, and I'm not saying they should be said, but I'm saying these are things said, and they must be seen distinctly from this tweet, and we must not attach
So what do you say I must do in relation to those tweets?
Those tweets,
What must I find?
because they don't suggest that you should not use them to mean that he was an apartheid spy. You can't use them to attach a meaning that is not there. First, I don't accept that they should be, but even if your ladyship were to say, let me scrutinize them, you will find that a couple of people say different things. 3 or 4 use the word spy themselves, but to link that to this tweet, I want to submit to your ladyship with great respect, is a leap of logic in interpretation. Well, we were asked whether, my learned friend said, well, Mr. Zuma seeks refuge in section 16. And these are her words. He uses section 16 to suggest that he must say whatever he likes. Those are his precise words. It's not true. That's not the submission. The submission is that to the extent that the word enemy agent, or to the extent that your ladyship is with them, that it's reasonable to attach the word apartheid spy, but that's not where we are. To the extent that the words we use are defamatory, we say they fit in within protected speech under section 16. And this description that we are suggesting that one right is absolute, it's not that at all. I would be the last to make that suggestion. I'm saying for the cases I have cited, this is political speech. And in one case that I'm going to use to your leadership, in this country, not in the US, they've helped us really look at these debates so that we sort of accept. It's the case of Wilders versus von Ulmerstein.
Will I find this in your net?
Yes, you'll find this.
Where would I do that?
No, I will make it. Assuming it's not there, I will give the citation. I'll give the citation.
You'll email me.
We've been told we got the email address, and I will email this. It's just I wanted to say this because to the extent that the American, I got this because we told using the American jurisprudence we're wrong when we're making the point that political speech, by its very nature, is full of hyperbole, colorful terms, because people are engaged. I don't know how many times I've heard people speak to each other in those terms. And Judge Davis says this in this case. The citation is 2017, Volume 4, SA 503.
What's the name of the case?
It's Waldis versus
W-A-L-D-I-S?
Yes, versus von, I hope I'm saying this right, von Ulmenstein.
What do you spell it? Will you just spell it then?
U-L-M-E
U-L-M-E
N-E-S-T-E-I-N. Yes. It's a page, the quote I'm going to use is page 513, that case. And he quotes a case there of the Democratic Alliance, typical, because it's a case between political parties that are engaging with each other. And he says, I quote, quoting that case, political life in democratic South Africa has seldom been polite, orderly, and restrained.
Yes, I'm familiar with that terminology. I didn't remember the name.
It has always been loud, rowdy, and fractious. That is not a bad thing. Within the boundaries the Constitution sets, it is good for democracy, good for social life, and good for individuals to permit as much open and vigorous discussion of public affairs as possible. Close quote. I'm using this case because it contextualizes our use of a much more rigorous analysis of this in the American jurisprudence. That basically, if you went to a workshop of judges and sat for a day, of course you would be bored at the end of the day because they use very calm language and the differences may be different. If you went to Parliament, where opponents are debating with each other, and none of them is wrong, the language you will find of how they refer to each other in person and to each other's views and each other's conduct is full of color, hyperbole, because that is the nature of a vibrant society. Now, of course, I must not be understood to say there are no boundaries, because there are. And I want to submit that in the spirit of this case that I've quoted, and I think your ladyship, I submit your ladyship must not disregard the discussion I make in my heads of arguments about the nature of political debate in other jurisdictions and how they've been described. We cannot simply disregard it because they treat it differently there. We are a society that seeks exactly what Judge Davis is saying: vibrant, open debate, and it's sometimes not nice. And I'm saying calling someone an enemy agent may not be nice. May not be nice. I wouldn't like to be called enemy agent. People have called me many things myself. Can I go to court and stop them and interpret things that are not there? And I'm suggesting that in this case, I'm submitting that it would be a leap to attach it. And I'm saying to your ladyship, if you read Mr. Hanekom founding affidavit and notice of motion, he truly draws that dagger out there. It's not even his dagger. I don't even think he should be called that personally. He draws the dagger and stabs himself with it. Takes him from nowhere. And after stabbing himself with it, post facto, finds comments of people to justify why he pulled the dagger lying there, sharp as it is, to stab himself. It was not intended, at least by my client, in that tweet.
You said sharp as it is?
I'm saying sharp as it is because...
And you also said that it's bad to be called an enemy agent.
Oh yeah, it's not nice. Those are my words. It's not nice.
What inferences might flow from that?
From
what inferences might flow?
Is that I'm hurt when you use it.
Well, what was intended? What do the words mean?
The words mean you work with parties that are opposition to your own party, in conflict with the prescripts of the organization you profess loyalty.
Okay, so while you're there, then you're going to put an identity to enemy.
Yes.
Whose name or face would you put to the word enemy? What was meant by it? Because that's where I'm going to start my analysis, right?
That's where I started. I mean,
yeah.
Let's start with the word.
You said use the word foe,
adversary,
and adversary.
Yes.
But of course, as you said, this is political speech.
Yes.
And has to be interpreted contextually. I'm not disregarding the dictionary meaning of the word, but
yes.
in the context, who would I have to say is the enemy here?
In South Africa in 2019.
Well, who would I say in the context of this tweet
is the enemy?
At the time when it's written, in the context it's written.
It's the EFF and it's the other political.
EFF is the enemy.
And the political parties in that context, yes.
Okay, the EFF is the enemy. Okay. And that he's an agent of the EFF.
Because,
what you're saying?
Because he seeks, in their view,
yeah.
he seeks to advance what is not the idea of his party, but that the ideas of its adversaries, yes.
And when you say known to whom? Amongst whom?
Known to him.
Known to the president or
to him and others. There are many people who have called him this. We've suggested.
No, it's Mr. the President's words that we're looking at,
yes.
right?
He says he's a known.
And when he says that that Mr. Hanekom is known
yes.
to be an enemy agent, we know that where he's now saying, what you're now submitting, is that it is known that Mr. Hanekom is an agent of the EFF.
Or opposition
right?
parties, yes.
Or you want to add opposition?
Yeah, because I can see where it's going. Yeah.
I'm trying to understand.
Yes.
And I don't want to put a meaning to words that he used, so you need to give me exactly what he meant when you use those words. So when you say known, what does known, what must I, what meaning must I attribute to the word known in the context?
He says he is known to himself and those in the ANC that he was working with the opposition.
Mr. Zuma.
Yes.
And others in the ANC.
That Hanekom was plotting with others. In fact, Mr. Hanekom says that himself. He says he was doing this with some of the other ANC members. So that is what I would ask your ladyship to do. And while I'm there, because this interpretation can take us somewhere, because we want to, if we run away from that part, we want to go back to apartheid SPA. I am submitting that it would be such a leap to leave that political conflict of the time, which is now, and seek refuge to get the interpretation they want in a conflict that is long gone and past.
Well, context also includes the other words in the tweet. Two sentences before that. What meaning does a known enemy agent draw from the other words in the tweet?
In the tweet itself.
Yes.
It says, I'm not surprised. He says, I'm not surprised. I think logically it links when he says, I'm not surprised. It links logically with the fact that it's no.
Yes.
That's what it means.
Right.
With the revelations. He says, it is part of the plan I mentioned at the Zondo Commission.
Now that's a part that I don't understand, whether it's your submission that it links or it does not link.
With the plan?
With what follows, the known enemy agent. Why talk about the Zondo Commission if it's irrelevant?
No, I didn't say it was irrelevant.
No, I'm asking. I don't know. So I'm asking you, what is the connection between that sentence?
The connection is exactly that he had spoken about the plan to oust him as head of state at the Zondo Commission. He did. We shouldn't attach a meaning we want to something here that is not. He says the plan, and that's why I said this self-serving piecemeal pulling out of what Mr. Zuma said in 3 days at the Zondo Commission to interpret this is unhelpful, because the plan to oust him is part of his testimony.
I'm putting aside the Zondo Commission evidence, because I need to analyze this very carefully. And I don't want to not have a good understanding of why these words were used in this context. So I'm appealing to you to explain it to me so I don't get the wrong end of it.
It's reminding me it's lunch, but we can address it now, or we can address it when you come back.
I'm happy to continue, and you said you weren't going to be long. I'm happy to run along.
I would end in the next 15 minutes.
Okay, let's press on, and then we can take an adjournment.
My submission, my lady, was this, is that known enemy agent must be interpreted in the conflict between the ANC and its own foes or adversaries now. Now. To invoke, and I'm not saying in other contexts people don't talk about apartheid spy. They do, they may still do. In fact, my learned friend quotes the president saying, in fact, no, she says this herself. Leaders must never be called apartheid spies in this country and all this. I don't even think we should get there, because it's not relevant.
Okay, since you're back at known enemy agent, okay?
Yes.
What I need, and you're saying the EFF is an enemy, and an enemy of whom?
Of those in the ANC. It says the opposition parties in the way described in Section 25 of its constitution, those who are its opponents.
So the EFF is an enemy of the ANC?
Yes, it's in the political context,
okay,
yes, it's
but
the
then
opposition.
My question is, because this needs some clarification,
Yes.
and I don't know whether I'm allowed to take any judicial notice of this fact because it's not pleaded, about what the ANC is. Is there any homogeneity, or is there some facts about the ANC today compared to the ANC in '94? Because is it a homogeneous organization?
My lady, I know my learned friend said the ANC is at war. I do not know, because it's not pleaded. I am no expert in the ANC. I have no idea what they do. What I'm saying is that you've got to understand this term in the context of the current political conflict, if there is conflict or differences, rather than to go as far back as whatever years before apartheid ended to draw this. And therefore, the context, that's why I started with Malima's own revelations. There is nothing in Malima's revelations that talks about the conflict during apartheid.
Well, then it brings me to the next puzzle that I have to overcome, and that is, if Malema is the agent of the ANC, and I don't want to draw any inferences about who or what the ANC is, but, and then it is...
If Malema is the agent of the ANC, I'm not...
No, enemy of the ANC.
Oh, no.
That's what you said, isn't it?
No, I haven't made that submission.
No, I thought you did.
No, I didn't. No, I didn't.
Yeah, I asked you who is the...
I said the EFF and other opposition parties, adversaries.
I beg your pardon.
I have not said Malema.
You correct. It was
Okay.
the EFF.
All right.
If you're saying that the EFF is an enemy of the ANC, right, and other opposition parties,
Yes,
to be precise.
in the political context,
Right.
yes.
If then it is also on the table that Mr. Hanekom approached them, colluded, as the word goes, with them, conspired on behalf of other members of the ANC.
I don't know.
Well, he conspired on behalf of somebody.
Well,
We don't know who.
I think it's dangerous for us. Let's deal with the fact that we know he did conspire with them.
Yeah, okay. To ask Mr. Zuma.
Yes.
He has not been disciplined yet, which is why I asked whether both parties are still members of the ANC and what are we talking about and what are we dealing with here.
Well, now
He
that
hasn't
we,
been disciplined.
now that we're talking about things that are not pleaded, including what your ladyship has asked me, that is, to use the ANC's word, being processed. I don't know, I never know what
Okay.
they say. I never know what they mean. So to say he has not been disciplined is actually inaccurate, because the ANC has come out to say that matter itself is being processed. Now, let me finish this point then, because that's the part that I think we're getting into areas that are not here, is that the discussion about what exactly in this context, I use the ANC constitution to describe how it describes acts of misconduct, working and colluding with people who are outside. Your ladyship says he must have colluded with somebody. Well, that may well be. That may well be. All I'm submitting to your ladyship is that in the context of differences between political parties about removing or not removing head of state, the opposition parties, even in ANC's own terms, it's for its adversary, its enemy.
So the reason for my question is I need to work out this, that in colluding with the EFF, an enemy agent, he was acting against the interests of the ANC. Is that the inference to be drawn? Whoever the ANC is. Is that what I should? Fine.
May I make the submission myself?
Oh.
In colluding with parties and individuals outside his party, that's the first thing,
EFF and opposition party.
opposition
Right.
party. And in conflict, there is nowhere in the papers we are told that he was mandated by his party to do so. Officially, no. In doing so, outside the prescripts of his own party.
You mean the Constitution?
The Constitution, yes. It's important because I think it's the only document that can describe better what we are debating than our value judgments. Because we're debating the ANC and how it deals with itself. Is that in the context of how it describes acts by members who work with people and parties outside itself, that collusion is working while you are inside the ANC you are pursuing the interests that are not inside your party, but are of those who are your adversaries, of the adversaries of your party.
Oh, so I don't have to find whether it was a good or bad thing for the ANC that he colluded in this manner. It's the mere breach of the ANC rule that he colluded with the enemy.
My lady, could you repeat that for me? I didn't get that.
Well, that's what I'm trying to establish. That what you're saying is that it is irrelevant whether this collusion by Mr. Hanekom with the enemy, EFF and opposition parties, was good or bad for the ANC is irrelevant because he broke an ANC rule. Is that the position?
It's the only context within which you can make an accurate assessment.
Okay.
It's the only one. Otherwise, if we do, it's going to be my value judgment, your ladyship's value judgment, and her value judgment. It is the only one that describes the reaction of another ANC member to conduct of another ANC member. He's not reacting to whether I like this person, I may not, because I'm influenced by all sorts of things. The ANC Constitution, I think, is the most accurate way of guiding our analysis of this, rather than our own views.
Well, my and your constitution is the most accurate.
Well, we can debate it, but it's another day whether.
There's no debate. I swear on oath.
No. I'm going there, but we are not debating your conduct. We're debating the conduct of an ANC member. Yes, your oath is that constitution, but we are debating whether the conduct of an ANC member within the context of his party violates the prescripts of that party. I have no qualms with which constitution is superior.
Okay.
Yeah.
I interrupted you then.
Yes.
Yeah.
My lady, then can I then suggest that what we do in our heads of argument, we have dealt with the cases
sorry, there was one other thing
yes,
which you didn't complete, and that is why was the Zondo Commission thrown in? I'm not interested in what interpretation the applicants put to it. I want to know, from Mr. Zuma's side, what did he mean when he threw in the sentence about part of the plan I mentioned at the Zondo Commission? There has to be some purpose. You agree?
No, there has to be some purpose,
Yes,
but I can to interpret his intention. I can interpret what it means. Yeah, I can interpret.
I mean, I can read the words for myself, and I can even
Absolutely.
use a dictionary to do
The
that.
plan
But
that-
in the context, what does he say he means?
Here is the context. It's very important because I kept saying, let's start with what conflict, what context is derived from Malima's statement, right? It's a conflict in the current political debate in Parliament at the time to remove Mr. Zuma. That's our context. That's our starting point. We can jump to apartheid if we like and elsewhere. That's the starting point. Right. Having established that context, because we can't get out of that context to reach what Mr. Hanekom wants to reach, then what's the next thing that in that context of that conflict of ousting a president? Mr. Zuma then says correctly about the plan. And the plan is the plan to oust him, which he testified about in all the plans he talked about.
Of which Mr. Derek Hanekom has not been mentioned yet, and assuming will not be mentioned.
I don't know. We don't know. And I don't think we should concern ourselves with that because it's not a consideration we should make. We should not even, whether Mr. Zuma is going to name or will name Mr. Hanekom as a spy or will not, is a matter that I think we should leave to him when he testifies, because he may testify that without evidence, in which case he will be in trouble, or he may testify with evidence. We just don't know. And I'm submitting that we do not have to get there. We do not have to stop him. What if he has evidence? And what if he doesn't? It's just none of our business. It's not the part that is we need to determine whether we should attach the words. I am submitting. If you read the revelations by Malema, don't get out of that context to go to apartheid and elsewhere. He talks about the conflict that was there at the time to ask the president. Zuma responds to it, and many people do. Others go out to talk about apartheid and the history, but Mr. Zuma and Mr. Malema in that context. And when he refers to a plan, indeed he testified about many plans to kill him and different plans at different times of his life. But one of the plans, which is the one he's talking about here in the context of Malema's statement, is when there were efforts to remove him as deputy president, which ultimately happened, and as a president of the country. That is the context. And I am submitting that to get out of that context, simply because we want to invite this hyperbolic statement called apartheid spy, is a leap of logic in my humble submission. I think we would have we can't get out of the context from Malema's statement and the responses thereto. And Mr. Zuma's tweet must first be understood in that context. And his reference to the plan must be interpreted to mean precisely the plan he testified about to oust him, because it's the only plan that he testified about that is consistent with the original sin, so to speak, Malema's statement in reference to ousting the president. To get out of that context would require imagination.
So let me just see that I understand you properly. You're saying that there's been an agenda to oust him as for as long as into history, into the ANC history, that there's been this plan to oust him from his position, various positions as the ANC. And that in the current context, that plan, whoever the actors are in the execution of the plan, is immaterial, but it happens to be currently Mr. Hanekom, because he conspired with the EFF. Is that how you want me to take it?
The actors, I'm going to get there. The actors in that conference that built up or that started the discussion is Mr. Hanekom. He claims that he has others, but I'm saying it's opposition parties that wanted to oust.
That's the current state of affairs. That's not the apartheid period.
That's what Malema is talking about. That's what Malema is talking about. He doesn't talk about apartheid himself. We just get out of this context to fetch apartheid because we are familiar with that term, because we think that's what it means, because intellectually we cannot analyze the conflict of the past 25 years without reference to conflicts a quarter of a century ago. I'm saying the dynamic, the conflicts politically in South Africa in the past 25 years have developed dynamism themselves. It's a dynamic political climate. And to keep thinking that when people beat each other up in political debates, they do so simply because they were political enemies or foes under apartheid, is actually itself ahistorical, because we know of so many people that have become part of different parties. I can list, and the list is endless, of people who used to be in the National Party who are no longer there. So that context itself has been contaminated by the new debates, new conflicts, new entrants in political debate. And I submit it's unreasonable to move to that. We have set out that we oppose this relief. First, because if one looks at statements that have been made before that about Mr. Hanekom, before even the tweet, it doesn't make it urgent at all to remove it. It would serve no purpose. The most dangerous tweets I have seen are not the statement by Mr. Zuma. Dangerous as in hurtful when I read them. Partly because they talk about someone I know myself, Mr. Hanekom. So I've read them, but it's not the one from Mr. Zuma. And therefore, we must analyze whether the relief sought will deal with that. And it can't deal with that because there have been statements that are worse before. In that context, we've attached them. And therefore, there is nothing urgent, because even if you granted that relief, it would not stop the tweets about which he's not complaining. The last bit is that my learned friend talked about the balance of convenience. No. Harm, sorry. Is that harm in this? We submit to your ladyship that it may well be that there is harm in statements that have been said, that have been tweeted subsequent to that. But we are submitting that to attach that harm first to the tweet is not correct. And secondly, that to stop him from ever saying what he has not said already, ever saying it, to speculate that he must never say it, and he must apologize for something he has not said itself. It is the exercise of his right to free speech that we must protect. And there is no justification. There is no harm that will be averted by simply removing his tweet, because his tweet has not attached the meaning that he attaches to, that is an apartheid part. And we submit it's unreasonable to suggest that that is the most reasonable interpretation. And then, lastly, before I talk about cost, is that to suggest that or to submit that he must be interdicted from testimony he is still to give before a judicial commission of inquiry is an incompetent relief. To ask him not to testify, or if he testifies, not to say certain things. We submit that relief is incompetent. Because, by way of example, if he goes to the Zondo Commission, and of course because he has started, and he has to, because he has to be truthful, of course, on the basis of whatever evidence he may have then in those proceedings, he is compelled to give that evidence, if it's true, and he can back it up. And that forum is the forum to determine whether or not, when he makes those submissions and the testimonies, like it is not these proceedings, and therefore we submit it would be incompetent to limit that possibility. My learned friend just wants me to make a point about final interdict, which I must raise now. This is from the case, the AfriForum case, because this is the final interdict. The AfriForum versus Pinau. It's, can I give the citation? 2017, volume 1, SA 388. And it's paragraph 19 and 20 I will read out, because it deals with a point which dealt with, but I thought I should raise it here for the final interdict. It says, there is no dispute that Mr. Pinar posted the 4 statements above. It's identical to what we're dealing with here. Disputes of facts have arisen on the affidavits in relation to the incident which gave rise to the posting and which is referred to therein. Paragraph 20 deals with what I want to raise about the final interdict. It says, a final interdict may only be granted if the facts averred in the applicant's affidavit, which may have been admitted by the respondent, together with the facts, this is the old plus connivance, that the alleged facts alleged by the respondents justify such order. Insofar as a final interdict is prevented by a genuine or bona fide dispute of fact, the applicants may seek an interim interdict pending the finalization of an action for a final interdict. In order to obtain this, they would have to show, well, and then it sets out the requirements of an interim interdict. I raise this point now because what we're dealing with here is on the basis of the case pleaded before you in the founding affidavit, in the context that I've set out from the statement, there is no challenge to the context we've set out, to the statement and what it says, and there's no reasonable justification for the interpretation attached to it by Mr. Hanekom.
So you're saying, if I understand you correctly, is that what he said in this tweet is true. And it's true because it's not a dispute of fact. That, in fact, it's come across admitted that Mr. Hanekom conspired with the EFF and other opposition parties to act on this issue. That's a statement of fact. And that is the basis on which the tweet was issued.
Yes.
And therefore, it is not false.
It's not false.
And therefore, if it's not false, I should not grant this interdict. I will only be able to find that it's false and go to the applicant's case if I find that it was more than this admitted fact.
Yes.
And that there are other things that come into the picture, and that is, I should read in the word apartheid. Fine.
I repeat what my learned friend said. If you find that it is more than what I say, we should lose. But if it's exactly what we've said and the context, we should win.
Then I shouldn't grant the interdict because it's not false?
You shouldn't grant the interdict. We don't reach that point. It's the principles my learned friend set out, which are set out in many cases.
I'm clear on that. But there's one other thing that I need to just get your response on, and that is paragraph 58 of your answering affidavit. Put your hands on that.
Paragraph 50.
58 that the applicant drew my attention to. It says there, it is true that Hanekom was part of those who deliberately sought to assassinate my character and discredit my political role both in the ANC and the country. It is also true that Hanekom used his position in the ANC and information of the ANC to support the enemies of the ANC and myself. A clear example of his role is the support that he gave to the EFF to bolster his political opposition. I accept that the statement is defamatory, but it is true and was a fair comment. What should I make of that?
Well, if the statement, because we say that in the context that, first of all, the statement itself on its own, without the interpretation, without attaching the words apartheid spy, is true. And that's but that it's true does not mean it's not defamatory. But we say, in the context that we've raised, of political speak, of the conflict between the parties, to call someone who has done what he did an enemy is fair comment, is reasonable. And as I've said, if more can be attached to that statement, then we are wrong. But we submit that on the basis of the statement that gave rise to all of this debate, the statement by Mr. Malema, which we should not cut out in our interpretation, there is no justification for the leap we make to apartheid spy, historically or in the current context of political conflict in the country. There is an issue of cost, but there is a harsh request for cost, which may I take instructions?
It's been abandoned about Attorney Clark. Oh, sorry,
no,
she's going to, you're persisting.
Yes, we're persisting, my lady. I've taken my instructions.
Okay, so you may address me on Attorney Clark.
Well, I think I'll return the favor.
Okay.
we stick to the cost because we believe in the point that we make is that this is a matter that shouldn't be here. It's an abuse of court process to bring a matter of this nature that cannot be resolved here. An interdict that cannot be granted because it would be meaningless to bring it here. One can understand what the political aims of bringing an action like this to stop Mr. Zuma from testifying further or to embarrass him, but it does not belong here. It's legitimate political strategy, but it does not belong in our courts. And we say an abuse of our courts should take a dim view of such political strategies and conflicts between parties which are legitimate in the arena of politics to bring them here to gain victories outside the court. And we ask for punitive costs on the basis that this is an abuse of court process. Those are our submissions.
Thank you.
We can take lunch.
Thank you very much. If you're not going to be long, and if you're happy, everybody's happy to persist, we can do that. Otherwise, I'll take it to lunch.
Milady, I would appreciate 15 minutes to organize my
Everybody's good with that? 15 minutes?
Indeed.
Sorry, Milady, I mean, I would appreciate a 15-minute recess to organize my thoughts.
Oh, okay. 15-minute recess.